let's give it a couple of minutes.
Well, while we're waiting, is anybody taking notes? I just sent.
I thought, Carsten, we'd probably do what we usually do, which is I end up making notes out of the VOD.
I'm not sure I got this right. You are very echoey at the moment. So
I'm always echoey, unfortunately. I've not yet put dampening up on my walls.
Yeah, maybe you can simply get closer to your microphone.
It's a conference speaker mounted on a wall.
Ah, there's Stefan. Excellent. I personally think we're unlikely to get anybody else at this point. James, if you agree, you can take it away anytime.
Yeah, I can start. I'll just do the formalities really quickly for the record. So good morning, folks, or afternoon or evening. This is the JSONPATH interim for April/May. Note well, this is an official IETF interim meeting, so the usual rules, disclaimers, and procedures apply. Please note well. Administrator, note takers, folks are welcome to take notes, but I will probably do what I usually do, which is make notes out of the VOD when it ends up on YouTube, probably at some point in the next week or so. Blue sheets are automatic. JavaScript, I don't think we need. I've got the chat open. We can look after. If anybody wants to chime in on that, that's fine. This is the agenda. Do we have any agenda bashing?
Yes, we do. Draft status. Update on issues. I guess all the things we wanted to talk about have issues. So
Sure.
We can nominate the issues as they come along. So I guess just a few words on draft status. We got Greg too. Excellent. Hi, Greg. I should turn my light on here. There we go. Greg, are you in North American time as well? Okay.
No, I'm in New Zealand.
Oh, New Zealand.
It's 8 p.m. Fortunately, I had this meeting. Yeah, 8 p.m. on Tuesday. I originally had this meeting set 2 hours from now, so I guess I got the time zone wrong. It's weird.
Excellent. I'm glad you made it. Okay, so on the draft status, the number of issues that still need to address is growing fairly small. In the usual last-minute fashion, when we went through when we started talking about this, like 48 hours, or actually it was last Friday, I guess we started talking about this, or Thursday. The number has grown just in our conversation in the last 48 hours, but the number that I called out from the existing issues list that I thought we should talk about was quite small. So I think we are getting close to being
Can
finished.
you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you see me?
No.
No.
Somehow I lost the sidebar with the microphone controls and everything in it. Huh. How do I bring that back?
Yeah, at the
Anyhow.
top. Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Anyhow, so I would hope that we could take this to working group last call in the relatively near future, and assuming that goes well, to IETF last call prior to the next IETF, which is when? Somebody know?
End of July.
End of July. Oh, so I think we should be able to do that. So that is speaking, as an opinion under my chair hat. I think that last time we did this, we agreed that we would take the question of adopting iRegEx to the working group. We did that. We did not hear any significant pushback. We did not actually announce that or declare consensus, but unless something surprising happens at this meeting, we will. I think we should go ahead and do that and move the draft over from Karsten's land to our own GitHub. So any comment on that? First of all, does anybody disagree with declaring consensus on adopting iRegEx and moving it over? Okay. Does anybody disagree that we should be able to take this to IETF last call before the next IETF? Okay, excellent. So I'm glad about both those things. Excellent. So now, as I said, I lost my sidebar. Do you know how to get it back?
Yes, at the top, press the leftmost blue button.
It's called presentation view, that one?
Yes.
Ah, I got it back. Okay, thank you. Okay, did anybody prepare a list of issues aside from me in email? Ah, excellent. Thank you so much, James. Oh, I had at least one other too.
Yeah, so I've based this off of what we've been talking about in the mailing list, last sort of 18, 24 hours, and just general activity. So if there's others you want to cover, we can obviously do that.
Okay, we got 183. That's fine.
Shall we start with normalization and just get it over and done with?
Yes, please. So I guess, as Glenn pointed out, there's nothing in the spec right now that that says that comparison is by IETF character by character.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Is that still up?
Yeah, my understanding was that at the last meeting we kind of all settled on this, adding some text, and it just needs to be added.
So we have two places where we need to discuss comparison. One is the actual comparison operator, and the other is where we do a member selection and compare the given member name with the actual member name. So I think these are the two places where we need to explain that we do not do any normalization.
Okay, so I think we have consensus here. I will volunteer to do a small PR to do those, and somebody else, unless somebody else wants to. Okay. Excellent. Next, James, can we have your list back? Right. All right. So at the current time, we do not require parentheses per the text of the most recent draft, and the examples reflect that. I believe, Greg, you were arguing the other side of that we should require them.
Yeah. For me, it's not a technical issue, I guess, from a parsing perspective. With or without them, it's feasible to parse the expression. However, I think from a readability standpoint, for an authorship, if the person who is writing a path includes the parentheses, I think it's much more readable. And also in Stefan's original blog post, as I mentioned at the bottom, he does include the parentheses there as well, which tells me that the vast majority of implementations will require them. So by having them listed as optional, I don't believe that's actually a backwards compatible change, or rather a change that would be compatible with existing implementations.
Greg, are there any implementation aspects that you see for having parentheses in the expressions, in the filter expressions, or is it purely the readability from the user's point of view?
It's I think it's a readability issue. I think a parser could figure it out without the parentheses fairly easily.
So,
but visibly, when I look at it with parentheses, I can isolate what the expression is much more easily than without the parentheses.
I see.
So readability is a very subjective thing. The other thing you said was interesting to me. I have no idea if it's true. Are we actually going to get greater interoperability across existing implementations if we do require parentheses? Did what's his name, Bergman, test that?
Everybody who wants to have parentheses can have it, can write it down. And if I remember correctly, there may be some implementations who don't need them. Is this correct?
That's the question that was asked. I don't know if we actually have that in the test or in the comparison suite.
I think,
but if your implementation does require them,
a single implementation who doesn't explicitly require parentheses, maybe.
Yeah, but Stefan, I think that's not quite what we're asking. I think Greg suggested that partly because of your original blog, that a lot of implementations would require them. So if that's in fact true, if there are a lot of implementations that do require it, then for interoperability, that's a pretty strong argument that.
Yes, I know this very well.
I just skimmed the comparison project, and I think all the examples have the brackets in.
So if all of so we haven't tested without the parentheses. That's the first thing. And then secondly, if an implementation such as mine does require the parentheses, giving it an expression that doesn't have the parentheses will not parse.
Is a syntax error.
Yes.
I see. So I'm fine with the majority. What do the majority think? Democratic vote. I'm for me, from my point of view, the missing parenthesis is a more general case, and there should be no backward compatibility issue if we leave it out in the spec. But everybody who wants to have it can write it. I see your aspect, Greg, that your implementation does require it. It's hard coded.
So
But
Stefan,
yes.
I think the argument that's being made is not the specifics of Greg's implementation. It's that there would be multiple implementations that have this behavior that require the parentheses. And if that is true, then that is an argument that we should require them, just because our goal is to maximize interoperability.
What would,
So-
what would
Yeah,
you
so
say
I think
adding?
we have two different terms here we need to be sure we use. There is backward compatibility and there is forward compatibility. And backward compatibility means if you have an existing JSON path expression, will that be accepted by the JSON path standard? And I think that is the case here. What we don't have is forward compatibility. So if people write their JSON paths to the new spec, they won't necessarily work with existing JSON path implementations. So I think it's pretty clear we don't have forward compatibility with at least a sizable chunk of the existing implementations, even though I don't know that in the Bergner test there's actually a test specifically for this question. We probably should add that. So basically, I think if we want to ensure forward compatibility, increasing forward compatibility, we have to stick with the parentheses. On the other issues here, well, I can definitely write unreadable JSON path today, and it's a little bit on the writer of a JSON path query to write this in such a way that it's readable. And I think it's a mistake to try to change the language to only allow readable instances. So if you want to have a certain style, you can just write that style. I think that's what Stefan already said. I'm actually old enough to remember the time when in the C language we wrote the thing that comes after the keyword return. We wrote that in parentheses. And that was a style that actually died out at the end of the 70s and took a long time to die. Anyway, so I think there is no technical argument except for the forward compatibility argument. The stylistic argument is really one where we think it's up to the query writer to write readable queries, and the procedural argument I think we already have discussed that, so I'm not going to comment on that. So I think the question really is this change worth reducing forward compatibility? And I think we will have to accept that we are reducing forward compatibility here, and we probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah, my reading of our charter is that if that a plurality of the implementations are doing one thing, then we should do that thing.
Yeah.
I think we need to actually put this as a test in the comparison suite and find out, get data on what current implementations actually do.
Yeah,
I know my implementation will fail, but I can't say that for others.
Yeah. So mine. I'm not a gambling man, but I bet that all implementations will not support this new syntax. And I think to some extent it could be perceived as a kind of gratuitous implementation hurdle for implementers of JSON path. So if they want to adopt the standard, then it's just an extra thing, which, you know, it's very hard to justify to them, I think.
I would like to agree to Greg's proposal to test it with the with Borgmar's test suite and get a feeling about the number of implementations that don't require the parentheses. I see the point of backward or forward compatibility. If the majority wants to have them hard in the spec, I will follow the vote.
Okay, is that easy to do?
Let's wait for a test and a small statistic result, how many implementations really accept leaving parentheses out.
So
Glenn, I don't
quick
have right access
comment.
into that repo. Do you?
Well, we could simply ask Christoph to do this. Just one comment. We don't usually vote on things in the IETF. Now, this is actually something that could be called a bike shed issue, where flipping a coin would be as appropriate as voting. So this is not a big thing. But yeah, let's get Christoph to make this run.
Yeah, and in this case, we're not really voting. We're not really voting on the working group members. We're suggesting a vote of the implementations.
Yes.
So in the past, I've had tests added via issues or PRs. I don't know if any of us have access to just merge PRs directly into that.
I can do that.
Glenn, you do. Can you add a test case or two that that covers this, and we can see what the results are?
My problem is I lost my environment, so I can't generate the full PR currently. I can make the source change. I don't think I can generate the full works, as it were.
Okay. Does it not generate on build, or like on the PR build?
If it does, then I can do that for sure. Yeah, I'll have a go.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so I think our takeaway from here is that if it turns out that a high proportion of the existing implementations do require parentheses, then we should change and do that. If it turns out that's not true, then we need to argue some more, because it comes back to issues of readability, which are imponderables. But we'll deal with that if we have to. But I think most of us agree that if a high proportion of the implementations require that, we would then go with parentheses. Does anybody disagree with that takeaway?
Okay.
Okay. All right. So Glenn, thanks in advance. Let us know how it goes. I'm super interested, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, Boolean literal.
I'm happy for filter expressions to contain any and all complete JSON, not just literals. But using literals, we can start small.
Yeah, I think that's really the interesting question here. This is an addition that may be useful for some diagnostic purposes during testing, but it doesn't really do much. And if people want this in as a foot in the door to put the rest of JSON in there as well, I would be inclined to say no, because we are not putting the rest of JSON in there right now, unless we completely change our direction here. I think the only argument that really holds water so far was I would like to be able to go into a JSON path expression and replace something by true so I can test the rest of the JSON path expression. And that's a weak argument for me, but certainly one I'm willing to consider.
Are you saying in a debugging scenario?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have an expression and that's not returning anything, and I'm wondering why. So I have two branches of an OR condition or something, and I replace one branch with true. Well, I could take out the entire OR, but then I have to juggle parentheses and all that. So it's easier to just replace the branch by true. And that's a convenience which I wouldn't want to dismiss. But yeah.
Same question. Do existing implementations tend to support this?
Mine does. I can't speak for others.
It's consequent to have them. You can always write true equals true instead, but that's somehow crazy.
True.
Glenn, I have the feeling you have the Bergman in front of you.
Yeah,
Do you see anything we should know about?
I just tried to post something into the chat. Yeah, there we go. So it looks like there isn't a consensus. Get a variety of results.
What's the path here?
It's at the top of the page.
There it is.
Key is greater than 0 and true.
Yeah. So it's using true as a predicate.
Which would
Essentially.
Which is exactly what we are discussing right now.
I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that some give non-numeric results.
Hmm.
Oof.
Okay.
Really needs a standard, does this thing, doesn't it?
Shouldn't that read or true?
Well, he is testing and true, maybe to also test whether the comparison fails for non-numeric values. But I
Yeah.
think the and true is about as expressive as a test as all true would have been.
Okay. There's another one which has got and false, which is equivalent to all true, I think. Try that.
What would be really cool with this website is if you could put in a random path and just have it run all of the implementations for that path.
Yep.
It's cool.
Yeah.
I mean,
Certainly-
this what he has is fantastic, but
You can certainly do that when you've set up the development environment. You can certainly run that locally, and there's even a Docker container you can use to run it. So it's not too bad if you like Docker.
yeah, I have mixed
So I
feelings
think
about
it's just looking at this, I get the impression that there are a lot of implementations that do not support this. If I'm reading this correctly at all. So my instinct would be to not introduce a new thing that's not widely supported in existing implementations.
Yeah.
So when you say this, you mean filter expressions without parentheses?
No, I'm talking about true.
Like the JSON glib library there says not supported. Are there quite a few that say not supported?
Well, there are a lot
Yeah.
that don't even support filter expressions. So that's a
Oh.
bit of a problem with the presentation style here, that you don't know why it doesn't support this. So you have to actually compare a similar query that just doesn't contain the ampersand false, and you have to do this manually.
Yeah.
I mean, the correct, if we believe in this, the correct thing should be what you see from, for example, well, what's the first, from CPP, the JSON cons. So that is what you would hope to see. And I'm just saying that there's a lot that are not doing that. They're doing other things, whether it ranges from errors to.
James, can you scroll down just a little bit so we can see the CPP?
You can just click on that thing. It's easy to pull that page up.
Okay.
The link is in the chat.
But as somebody said, there's a lot of them that just don't do.
So do we have a link for just the same thing with a filter expression that just says add.key greater than 0?
Just looking. Strangely enough, no, there isn't that one.
Okay.
I would like to point out that all the .NET implementations are in alignment.
I mean, there's a few that do what we would expect.
Yeah,
Stefan,
I
see,
guess
yours accepts also just key true, so it regard it.
Shall I add a test for a bold true, just to see what we get? You know, regardless of our decision-making process, I think it's quite interesting.
You could replace the true or false by true equals true. That should work, or 1 equals 1.
Yeah, one equals 1 is probably the one that people would be using. It's the same number of characters as true. So
I don't really have strong opinions on this. Is there somebody on the call who wants to make a strong argument for yes or no on this?
The only practical use I see of this is that debug scenario. I can't think of a practical use where you would want to include this in a production environment.
Yes.
The only other I'm scratching around for scenarios, but the only other thing is if you're doing predicate logic and you've got a complex filter expression, you can do the usual thing of spotting that summing in brackets is, say, you might have key is greater than 0 and key is less than 0, and you might replace that with false as a kind of refactoring step. But then you'd end up with temporarily an invalid JSON path, and you have to get rid of that. Keep going. So
yeah, that's still authorship of the path and debugging.
and you can use 1 equals 1 and 1 equals 0 as your stand-ins.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I suggest that on the grounds of minimalism, that we just not do this.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think that the same forward compatibility argument can be made as with the previous one. It's weaker, but it's still an argument.
So in the
So
interest
the
of
only
moving along, go ahead.
so the only literals that we'll have are numeric values. I guess literals. So literal isn't a numeric value. So the only literal that we'll have is null. Then we'll have numeric values and strings, right?
You can make a case that it's sort of annoying to have literal null but not literal true and false. Having said that, literal null is something that you would use all the time in production, looking
Yeah,
for
that's useful.
explicit nulls. So not hearing anybody, wanting strongly to preserve true and false, I suggest we adopt. What's that?
Question.
We do
Scenario.
have.
Go ahead, Greg.
If we do, if you're searching for, not exists, but specifically properties that, or items that contain properties with the value of true or with the value of false. Can you do that without the literal?
Yeah, we have true.
Comparisons allow true and false.
Hmm.
So it's not true that we don't have literals for true and false. The question was just, can we use them in place of a Boolean expression?
Yeah.
No. So, okay, let me type this into the chat real quick.
You must compare it with true or false if you explicitly want to know if the value in question is or has that value.
Yeah. So what I've typed into the chat, can you do that without the false literal?
But we have a false literal. We just decided not to be able to use it in the Boolean context. It can be used in a comparison. So if you look at the grammar, where is that? Comparable equals number, string, literal, true, false, null, singular, path.
Good morning.
Okay, so you're saying it's valid in equality, but it's not valid in a Boolean operator.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird.
No. We're currently separating the domain in which JSON values can occur from the domain in which we are making Boolean decisions. So just as we can't add, we cannot add two integer values,
Okay.
because that would be crossing that domain. The expression language doesn't allow you to use a Boolean literal, that would be a JSON value, in a place where we want to have a Boolean value on the JSON path side. So that may be a weird thing, but it's very self-consistent at the moment.
Okay, so we're considering true and false as
JSON
basic
values.
literals, not actual Boolean values.
Yes.
Okay.
You cannot evaluate true or false. You can compare it, but it's like null. I mean, null is also something that cannot be in a Boolean expression.
Okay.
And maybe not
That's
more
gonna be an
natural to
interesting
have
one
true and false there, but it's not what we do right now.
Okay, that's going to be an interesting one to clarify in the spec, but yeah.
A single 1 or 0 isn't allowed. Singular 1 or 0 isn't
Right.
allowed as a Boolean expression, but true and false are. So they should be Boolean expressions or interpreted as such, I think.
No, right now the current grammar doesn't allow you to put true in a Boolean expression context.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the literal true.
Yeah.
You can put 1 equals 1 there, which is true.
But
But I
this
think
is
it's a very healthy thing to have a separation between the things that the JSON path query expression operates on and the JSON values themselves, which occur in comparison expressions.
Yeah. So that we're interpreting it as a JSON
ah
value,
yeah
not
yeah.
as,
I see. Okay.
not
Yeah,
as
yeah,
a Boolean value.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We'll need to be very. I'm fine with that, but we need to be very clear with how we state that in the spec.
Well, I think the grammar is not ambiguous. The grammar allows you to, compare things against true or false or null in a straightforward way. It does not allow you to put them in literals in Boolean expressions.
That's fine.
Um,
I think that's fine. I would suggest that this particular case, given the nature of the true and false English words, may deserve a note. I don't know.
We probably should explain this domain separation
Yeah.
and use this as an example.
Could you say that again, Carson? It broke up.
We probably should explain the domain separation between JSON values and the Boolean values that JSON path uses itself, and use the false in an expression with false in such a Boolean context as an example.
Yeah.
Okay, does that, so I think what I hear is that people are saying, let's leave the grammar the way it is and insert a note explaining the difference between Boolean expressions and things that you're matching, values that you're matching.
Yep.
Sounds right.
Sounds like a simple change. Okay, shall we move along?
We've gone through the 3 issues that I put on my slides. Is it worth us, with the time that we have now, just quickly going through any other issues and perhaps clearing them out? Or does anybody have a particular thing they want to bring up?
Karsten, should we have an argument about security considerations?
Sure, go ahead.
I don't think they're necessary.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, okay. So we maybe have to put in a little bit of knowledge about this IETF thing that has been going on for 40 years, and people really like to have security considerations in specifications. And generally, the trend has been to be on the inclusive side in what should be explained in the security considerations. This first item here, I don't know if you can show the actual spec, maybe slightly easier to read. The first item in section, what was it, 5.1?
Yeah, 5.1.
Is I mean, we know that, we all know that, but that's really the problem with security considerations, that actually the people who are writing the spec often know all that, but since we are not writing down that information, an implementer may actually never come upon this information, because they are just reading the spec, and all the security implications that the spec has may not be available to them. So I think we given IETF tradition, and given the fact that there will be implementers here that are not necessarily used to thinking in terms of implementation security, I think we really want to be on the inclusive side here. Now, whether the text actually manages to do that, can you maybe increase the size a little bit? Whether the text actually manages to do that, we can discuss that. Just increase it
Right.
enough that the. Go ahead.
So concretely, we're having Karsten and I are having an argument in which I am suggesting just dropping the first paragraph here under 5.1. The thinking is that, so in a lot of protocols you have JSON, okay, and whenever you are processing JSON, you should never use eval, of course, because if you're in JavaScript, you should never use eval because all sorts of terrible things can happen. And in the case where you're writing an IETF RFC, you should say that. If you're handling JSON, you should say, please do not use eval to process the JSON. And I believe that is more or less what the first paragraph here in 5.1 is saying.
Actually, that's not what it is trying to say. It's not about JSON. It's about the expressions in the JSON path. So you may be reading this with more information in your head than the actual person addressed by this text will have.
Okay, so as a potential, we should let Greg in here in a second, but as an implementer, I really have trouble understanding what this is telling me to do or not to do.
Yeah. So let's fix the text instead of deleting it.
Right, so Greg?
So I don't come from a JavaScript world. JavaScript, I can read the language and write it a little bit, but I don't have a lot of experience in it. And I don't understand what running eval on JSON data is, why that's bad. Because to me, JSON data is just JSON data.
Right,
Or
because
if you're
eval assumes what you pass it is code, and it evaluates it and runs the code. And
okay, that makes sense. I thought you were just passing it JSON, which is just data.
So JSON is valid JavaScript code.
It can be.
Well,
JavaScript
more often
is
than not, it
valid
is.
JSON.
But the difference is that, when you mix up data and code, things can go wrong. And that's why we're sort of taking this very dogmatic thing of you shouldn't eval it, you shouldn't execute JSON. You should parse
and if
it.
you are in the world of JavaScript, it has a perfectly good JSON.parse thing if you want to actually parse JSON and turn it into a nice set of live JavaScript data, and it's safe. I believe generally. So Karsten, so can you help me understand what you're telling people not to do here, or what to do?
Well, essentially what I'm trying to explain here is that taking an attacker-controlled JSON path expression and transmogrifying into something you send to your interpreter is bad.
That feels very general and non-specific.
In my original implementation, I pragmatically reused the underlying scripting engine, and I indeed pragmatically used eval, and eval is evil because it simply runs the code in which it sees, and it's in fact source or possible injection attacks. But serious implementations should be aware of never ever use eval in JavaScript. I don't know about the other languages. I can't imagine that C# allows to, without critics, evaluate any code. I don't know. But I'm not sure if this first sentence is first should I see it addressing JavaScript. I don't know if this is really necessary to have it inside.
Secondarily, we're not building this on the underlying engine anymore. We're defining in our syntax what the expression content can be. As such, I don't know that there's anything there. I don't see an instruction that could be passed to any kind of underlying engine that can be executed. If you're doing nested paths, maybe you could construct a very deeply nested JSON path that effectively DOSes a server, possibly, but I don't think that we're doing nested paths that extensively. We've got an open discussion in the emails, apparently.
Karsten?
Greg, your argument boils down to nobody would be stupid enough to do it the way we are warning
No.
against. And I definitely can tell you that, yes, people will be stupid enough to do it that way.
No, what I'm saying is that it's our language is not based on any programming language. It's explicitly defined by us and would need to be parsed.
Yes, but people do write parsers doing regular expressions and regular expression substitutions. So in the issues comments, I gave an example of how that might look like in an implementation. And this is essentially just a warning for people not to do that. Actually, what I was going to propose, but now the text is gone, what I was going to propose was the maybe getting rid of the third sentence because it's kind of redundant. And I think the first two sentences can contain all the warning that's needed.
Yeah, I mean, it may be slightly different, but this is similar to my concern about regexes. If we allow arbitrary regexes outside of iregexp, then someone could do a CPU attack by exploiting an implementation that takes a long time on a particular regex. So it's the same kind of issue, isn't it?
Yes.
So you're saying don't feed this to some, let me see, feeding parts of the query to an underlying programming language engine, e.g. JavaScript. So in this case, if I were implementing JSON path in JavaScript, I would definitely feed the expression to JavaScript code to parse it using a hand-constructed parser or a parser generator. So what are you telling me I shouldn't do? Can you give me one?
You shouldn't run the expression
code
as JavaScript.
Well, of
it's
course,
okay to write code, but it's not okay to inject attacker-controlled text into your programming language engine. The difference is in your example, you are writing the code, and in my example, the attacker is writing the code.
I'm just looking at the issue here. So Karsten did write a long comment on the issue.
So historically, what people are doing is they're taking the content of the expression in a filter and running that as the underlying language. And what I'm saying is that we're defining that, and it's not based on any underlying language. It's defined as JSON path. And so there's not going to be an engine that necessarily supports that expression.
Well, I'm not sure, because
and if you're passing that to the underlying engine, then the engine would be expected to fail.
In
We could
Carson's
imagine-
comment, he says that, you know, at sign greater than 3.5, you know, so if you have a JSON path that's, you know, $.a question mark at sign greater than 3.5, that, okay, sure, you might pass greater than 3.5 to your interpreter. That's bad.
Yes.
I mean, we could imagine a language which had a subset very similar to the filter expression language in JSON path. And should such a language come along in the future, we wouldn't want people to delegate bits of this syntax to the engine. Yeah, so
Except if it's fully validated.
yeah,
The
absolutely.
current text set.
But you know, the exact example of JSON path, I think, has changed because we don't have expressions in the same way that we used to have. You know, it doesn't talk about delegating to the underlying scripting language the way that the original blog post did. So I think things have changed, but I think the principle is still there.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to underestimate the ability of programmers to find places how they can reuse the underlying scripting engine for doing the implementation. So this is essentially what I would want to warn against.
Okay.
Just
Well, if you want to continue to put that warning in there, I guess that's fine. It doesn't hurt anything. But for me, doing something like that is such an extraordinarily bad idea that I wouldn't expect any serious programmer to do it.
This
So
will
I
not
think you're
only be implemented by serious programmers.
so Greg, I think you're in a minority there. I think, you know, the culture is to be super aggressive about highlighting things that could be insecure, even if they're dumb. I guess my complaint here is, I guess maybe this is just an editorial issue. I'm just arguing this paragraph is not helpful enough, and so I'm saying, okay, remove it, and Carson's saying, no, improve it. So let's see if we can improve it. Okay. Anybody want to talk about this one further?
Well, okay. So this particular issue aside of not passing portions of the expression to the underlying engine, are we going to be editing the spec every time we come up with a new vulnerability? Or so how are those going to be managed?
Well,
Do we have a list somewhere?
there is a limitation to what we can do, but we already know this problem. And if we don't write it in now, the ISG will make us do it. So
Okay.
we might as well write good text for that now. And yeah, it can be shortened. Yes, it can be made more useful. So let's try to do that.
I just don't want us to get into a rabbit hole of trying to search for vulnerabilities, and just so that we can list them in the spec.
Every potential vulnerability. We just have to answer to the ones that we can think of at this point in time. You know? At a later
For
point,
example,
we find, you know, some absolutely crazy stuff. The heartbleed of JSON path, for example, then, you know, we can publish additional documents about that, or biz the spec, or, you know, we just need to do the best that we can do with what we know now. That's the only requirement. There's no exhaustive requirement.
For example, if you look at that same section 5.1, if you look at the second paragraph, it just points out that since we have regular expressions, if you're going to allow attackers to submit arbitrary regular expressions, then a smart attacker can probably do a denial of service attack on you with a pathological regular expression, particularly if they control both the JSON data and the regular expression in the path. And that kind of thing, yeah, that kind of thing has to be in here. Okay, now the second, since we started this, I'm going to say let's talk briefly about the issue I raised on the second one, 5.2 here, which once it occurred to me, struck me as a real issue, which is that if you require IJSON, which is to say JSON doesn't allow duplicate keys and doesn't have numbers outside of the IEEE 754 range and doesn't have totally broken Unicode, you should get pretty deterministic results. But if you don't require that, if you allow those things, a security policy based on JSON path probably just doesn't work very well, because people can send you broken JSON that will provoke non-deterministic behavior. So I think that's what section 5.2 is really trying to say.
Yeah, I think it's not limited to that specific case.
What do you mean by deterministic behavior here? Do you mean by particular implementation or across implementations?
Yeah, so you could write a JSON, you could write, if you're using JSON path to enforce a security policy, you say, you must not process a message that has, source Russia in it. Okay, but, if you allow bad JSON where you can have an object containing the source field 3 times, well, depending on the implementation, sometimes it's going to see source Russia and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I hope I haven't offended any Russians. Sorry.
I do know that there are languages that the parser itself is non-deterministic in those duplicate key scenarios. We have experience with that in JSON schema.
Oh, it's absolutely the case. There are some that take the first one. There are some that take the last one. There are some that throw a syntax error.
There are some that take random. Like,
yeah,
you run it
it's
multiple times and it'll give you a different one.
That's why IJSON exists, to give people who want to defend themselves against that a spec to point to. Okay,
yeah,
so
the question is whether JSON path implementations will always be used with validating IJSON parsers. And of course, the answer is no.
right.
So I think this security consideration here is needed. The question is, how many examples do we actually have to give in the second paragraph? Do you actually have the spec? We could look at those paragraphs. So we're talking about 5.2, right?
Yeah.
And I think the first paragraph is the way it should be.
Yes, I agree.
The second paragraph is specifically calling out the order of JSON objects, of members in JSON objects. And I'm wondering whether what I wrote is actually true. So
I had a problem with that. So I could easily understand how if you didn't have an IJSON enforcement, an attacker could send things that would be likely to, non-deterministic behavior. I didn't really understand how ordering of object members could be used to work around security policies or create a vulnerability.
Yeah, the example is actually one where IJSON filtering is not being done, and the protective application uses one order to resolve duplicate keys, and the protected application uses another order.
Right.
So the protective application makes sure that foo is not set to bar, but foo is actually set twice, and the protected application happens to pick up the other one.
Right. So I would generalize that essentially all of the failure modes that are explicitly forbidden by IJSON could be used to look for vulnerabilities. Huge number parsing, toxic, UTF-16 surrogates, etc.
Yeah, so you would propose to replace the second sentence with a pointer to IJSON?
A little bit of text saying that, in particular, here is a well-known set of sources of inconsistent behavior. Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay, once again, I guess this has come down to just an expression of editorial concern, not anything where I think we need to search for consensus. I think, we understand, we agree reasonably well what we're trying to say. Okay, that's all the things I know about. Does anybody else want to raise another issue for the interim meeting to discuss?
My concern about the IRegXP spec and its handling of non-IRegXP expressions.
Okay. So the issue here, go ahead, Karsten.
That's actually just an instance of the general issue that we haven't really said how a JSON path implementation should react to extensions.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it in the context of the IRegXP spec itself, though, because I feel that I'm missing something in terms of Carsten's statements about it being just a format, and we don't need to describe what happens when you step outside the subset.
Well, Glenn's point is that, if suppose I offer an IRegEx, and since we're JSON path, let's say it's in the context of a JSON path, I offer an IRegEx filter, and it contains some horrible, gnarly Perl PCRE back reference explosive thing. So first of all, it's dangerous. Secondly, it's not interoperable because a lot of implementations would presumably follow our rules and simply just not take that. And so it would be reasonable to, in the IRegEx, to say that implementations must report things that are not allowed by IRegEx. And the argument we were having was, is that a good idea? Yes, I think we can all probably agree that's a good idea. So should that be a must or a may or a should? Karsten, I haven't heard from you on this one.
Yeah, I think I sent a few messages, but I think my main point is that we're having the same problem we're having at the JSON path level. And that's why I would like to discuss this together. So right now, I don't think a lot of people are arguing that the JSON path implementation must reject anything that isn't standard JSON path, because that would essentially kill backward compatibility. So I think we have to be careful what we ask for here. So if we say JSON path implementations only ever can accept valid unextended JSON path, then we ask all the implementers of JSON path to implement a special mode that does all the checking, and of course about 5.5% of them will actually do that. So that's the one end of the argument. The other end of the argument is, of course, the one that is made in the draft IAB protocol maintenance document, that it's actually good to have checking implementations. So you want to be informed about an interoperability problem as early as possible. So that's a conflicting set of goals. And I think we just need to define for JSON path what the right compromise between these goals is. And a spec like IRegEx needs to be flexible enough that you can accommodate different users. So if I'm going to propose a version of CTDL 2.0 that uses iregex, I will probably want to be rather open to other W3C regular expressions for reasons of compatibility. So an existing CTDL spec that uses character subtraction, character set subtraction may not be particularly useful, but yeah, making it invalid right now on all implementations that do implement that is not the right thing to do. So it's really the job of the referencing specification to say which level of compliance checking is appropriate. What we could do for iregex is actually define terms such as a strict or a checking implementation. I think that's actually what we should do, also to alert users of the iregex specification that they have to make this decision.
I'd be comfortable with that, provided we could say something in iregexp's security section to say something about non-strict implementations. You know, about the downsides of non-strict implementations.
Good point.
I mean, the value, the reason iregex is apt to be useful is that if I'm careful to write an iregex as opposed to copying and pasting from some Perl code, I expect to get the benefit of interoperability, and it would improve the interoperability if the implementation could yell at me when I paste that in, and it says that's probably not going to work in many implementations. So I think it's what I think we should do more than what you said, Karsten. I think yes, that's a perfectly valid way to go, is to define implementation classes, strict and non-strict. But I think there's a place for a little bit of preaching here and encouraging implementers to provide the syntax checking and reporting. I wouldn't go as far as a must, but I think it would be beneficial for implementations to do that, and we should say so.
That echoes my suggestion as well, in that an implementation should implement just what's in iregex, which just this subset. Anything out of that, to me, should be an option that is enabled by the consumer of the implementation. The implementation can be free to support syntaxes outside of iregex, which is fine, so long as that support is hidden away behind some option.
I mean, that
Or
was my
if
start.
it's just a regex, or if it's just a generic regex library, say .NET's regex built-in system, you could have a compatibility mode setting. Like there's the .NET's regex, you can set it up. You can give it an option to run it as a JavaScript regex, or various other flavors of regex. It supports 3 or 4, and so you can tell it which particular flavor you want it to support, and iregex could be one of those.
I mean, that was my starting point. That I thought, I thought iregexp should be strict, must be strict, but I was then thinking about should be strict, and Tim's counter to that was that the implementation cost, we're then putting an implementation cost on every implementer who follows the should requirement. So weakening to may kind of lets them off the hook slightly, and the interop is an issue, isn't it? So so the point being that if we say should, essentially what we're saying is every iregexp implementer should write a parser or generate a parser for this subset.
Julian?
Julian is in the queue. Maybe we should let him speak.
Yeah, Julian, please. We don't hear you. Julian, are you trying to speak? We don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Ah, yeah, now we hear you.
Hello, good morning. Sorry for jumping in, but just one thought about rejecting or not rejecting things that are not in IREC-EXP. We as in the Java content repository working group ages ago, when we defined a language that looked like SQL but wasn't SQL, struggled with this problem that people wanted to add extensions that are like SQL from somebody else. And the problem being that you close extension points for the future if you allow extensions to be made outside the spec. So if you say IREC-X by default configuration should only allow what's in the spec, then you actually should force people to reject everything that looks like an extension to be rejected. Just to state the obvious, right? Because in SQL you can have annotations that get ignored, but if people start relying on these, this extension point is essentially taken away from future versions of IREC-X, if that ever happens. So this is a pattern in query languages or things that look like strings where people put in new things and can get away with that. And if a conforming implementation just ignores that, later on you want to define something what it means, then you're in trouble. So be careful in how you define the potential extension points in the future, unless you are absolutely sure that you don't need extension points in the future. So it's a tricky path between having a strict syntax and then allowing people to support more than that. Because if people start supporting more than that, you might be unable to standardize that in the future when implementations diverge. So just sorry for jumping in, but I just had that thought crossing my mind.
I think that's a pretty good point. And I also think that there is a slight difference here because when you do a SQL extension, you actually are sitting down and extending SQL. When you are writing a IREC-X implementation that isn't strict, you're probably saving work by just handing over stuff to the regex engine that you're using. And the question really is, do we want to put the onus of nudging people to only use interoperable JSON path queries? Do we want to put that onus on every implementer of JSON path? Or is that something we just recommend people to do, but the JSON path implementation doesn't get wrong by not catching a deviation? And of course, we could make another argument that says you should not willfully put in deviations.
At the moment, just based on listening to the discussion, this feels to me like a should, not a must. And I would certainly be friendly to both for IREC and JSON path, saying implementers should report on strings that do not comply with the grammar here. With the understanding that would mostly be extensions and supersets and so on. Must seems like too high a barrier and would probably scare off some implementers. But this is clearly something that I think would be beneficial to end users.
So if you put in a should, you always have to explain when that should doesn't need to be heeded. So what's your definition of when that doesn't need to be heeded?
If you don't care about interop.
Wait a minute. The thing is still interoperable. It just doesn't help query writers to write interoperable queries. But
Yeah.
the thing itself is interoperable. That's a very big distinction.
Mhm. I mean, realistically, the answer to that question is when it makes the implementation not cost effective. Because I just can't face the thought of writing all the test data. That's not a good answer, is it?
I was thinking about the testing side, and if you generate the parser from something that's kind of can be compared to the ABNF in IRegXP, then you should be in pretty good shape without testing. I think testing is going to be a bottomless pit in this area.
I've seen technologies where you could take that ABNF and generate a fuzz test from it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that'd be good.
So Karsten, if I understand you, you would not really be friendly to a should level thing here?
I think I'd rather simply define terms that allow you to distinguish an implementation of eggs from a checking implementation of eggs, or a strict implementation, whatever term we come up with, and explain why it actually is a bonus to have a checking implementation, and then let the market sort out whether people will want to be able to advertise their implementations as checking or not.
I'd be okay with that. Okay, anybody want to say anything else on the subject?
Tim, where exactly do you propose to write the should? I'm scanning the filter expression syntax ABNF, but in its surrounding, I can't see where, in the context of regular expression, IRegEx, there is no should, or what should or must are we talking about exactly
So
right now?
so I think the answer is roughly the same for the two specs, one for IRegEx and the other for JSONPath, and it would be quite high up near the front of the document, saying we divide software implementations that process X, whether X is IRegEx or JSONPath, as checking or non-checking, and explain what that means, and then say that checking provides the following benefit. It allows a writer of these things to have a higher assurance of interoperability.
And the security implication of checking as well.
Yep.
Can I just check while we're together a kind of meta discussion that came up about whether this kind of language should go in IRegXP as well as JSONPath, because Carsten was kind of pushing back and saying IRegXP is just a format, we should keep this kind of language out of there, if I understood correctly.
So
I was pushing back against actually making a single decision. I think what Tim just said is exactly what I plan to do in IRegEx.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think the benefit of that approach is it kind of it matches reality, what was going to happen in practice, and so we can then talk about reality in the spec rather than putting ourselves out on a limb one way or the other.
Yep. Okay, are there any other subjects that are a good investment of our time at this point? Any other issues that nobody thought about that we should talk about?
Do you want to talk about functions?
I think we agreed that they're not going to be in 1.0.
That's fair. Does that mean that length isn't going to be in 1.0? Because that's pretty common.
I believe under the current shape of the spec, length is not supported, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, there are two things missing. First of all, we don't have that extension point, and I think that actually may be a mistake. And the other one may be defining length. And we definitely could fill a whole document on what length actually means. Probably not so much for arrays, but definitely for objects and for strings and certainly for numbers. Yeah, so maybe we want to define the extension point and use length as our exercise to do this. But length itself actually is pretty difficult to define.
I'd like to know whether the length of false is greater than the length of true.
We already
So-
restrict comparisons to a certain domain, so we want to restrict length to a certain domain as well. And the question is whether we just want arrays in there, or whether we also want strings in there. And if we want strings in there, this is a very, very big can of worms.
Yeah, not really. Unicode characters, you count them. But
So the
But
real question
on-
is, can we solve this in the next 30 minutes?
well, I think there's something we can talk about, which is that, as Karsten just said, on several occasions, people have argued that it would be good to, in the 1.0 JSON path, identify what extension points are. And that proposal, that idea has been raised several times. Nobody has ever written a PR saying what that might look like. And whereas I think that's perhaps a desirable thing to do, I'm not going to write the PR, and unless somebody else does, I don't think we're going to do anything about that. Glenn?
Yeah. I'm definitely not going to do it.
Okay.
It's above my pay grade.
So I think, Greg, I think, at the current time, the working group can live with not having length in there.
All right. It's recorded. Tim said so.
Okay, the floor is open for new business.
So what did we just decide? I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Sorry, Karsten, what did you say?
What did we just decide?
We agreed that the spec currently does not allow length. That for the moment, the working group, my perception is that we're okay with that, and that nobody has yet submitted a PR to define extension points. I'm sure if somebody did, we would look at it and think about it. But I'm not
That's
going
the part I wanted to know, because I might write such a PR.
Sure. I'm sure if you did, some of us would look at it.
What about at index? Do we need also extension points for that? And don't include that in 1.0?
Say again. I didn't index what?
At index to address keys
All right.
in filter expressions.
There are 2 points with that. First of all, we need an extension point. And if we use the same extension point we use for length, it would be index open parenthesis add closing parenthesis, which is, yeah, okay. But yes. And the second observation is that we are violating the don't look up property that the processing model currently has. Well, we are looking sideways, not really up, but so far we only could look down. And I think that's a decision that can be made at the point in time. Extending that processing model is a decision that can be made at the point in time when we actually put in index. But having the extension point in the syntax, I think that's actually valuable enough that we should do that now.
Okay.
We talked about this at the previous meeting, and I think the direction that the conversation went was we need to reconcile the changes to the processing model, like Carsten described before. We can include it into the base spec, but that itself would be a bit of a can of worms.
Yeah, if you include the current object key or the array index that you're processing within a filter expression context as part of the processing model, then I think some of that is resolved. I don't know that you're really looking up per se. You're just widening the scope of the context.
Yeah, all
Okay,
I'm
but,
saying is that we can wait with doing that when we actually define that extension.
Yep.
I suppose the point is that if we allowed extension points, then they are not limited in future to just looking at index and length. They could generally look up as well.
Yeah, if we decide to change the processing model for such an extension, that's true. So we could have an ancestor access like in XPath and have all that fun.
Mm-hmm. Such an extension point to do mathematical operations as well, like minimum and maximum, and you give it a list of things.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting because if we define this functional syntax, we have to define what goes between the parentheses.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Let me think about that.
Yeah. In regard to the index being what we think, or even the length being like index open parenthesis at close parenthesis. I don't know that we would necessarily need to do that. I would suggest, and I think I've written this somewhere, I would suggest having an empty parameter list, and the at would be just part of the context that is implied. It's kind of an implied parameter. I wouldn't necessarily include it. I don't know. It's an idea.
Yeah, we don't have to design that now.
No, we don't. Just planting a seed.
Yeah,
Okay.
Passing at explicitly opens the door to passing other things explicitly, like
Yes.
at.x.
At $, or index $, which would just be very confusing.
Okay, folks. Barring any other things being brought forward, I suggest we're finished.
Yep. Shall we plan when our follow-up interim meeting is? Noting that next IETF is towards the end of July.
So first half of June, perhaps? Or actually,
Just so
second half.
people are aware, I'm on vacation for most of May. We'll be away from keyboard, so that's a limitation for me.
Perhaps we should do something week starting either the 6th or 13th of June.
Yep.
I would propose the 13th because of public holidays.
Flag Day?
Public
Sorry?
holiday for whom?
Well, for myself, being selfish.
So the 13th of June, we could do a doodle on that.
Yeah,
The
I'll
week
do the
of
doodle
13th.
poll as I usually do.
Yeah, that's
Tim,
good
if
to
you
me.
could continue to send out the "we're having the meeting right now" emails, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I just missed this because these is historically at 2 a.m. my time, but then the time changed and it started at 1. So
Okay.
It's been historically 10 at my time, and now the time changed and it's 8.
gotta get the whole world running on UTC, you know, then everything will be fine.
I'm happy with that.
Okay, folks. Thank you for your time. I think we made some good progress, and see you next time.
Oh, one minor note that this group should be aware of. I am in the process of interviewing at Postman for their open source division with my work with JSON Schema. They are also tangentially interested in my work here as well. So I may be soon representing Postman a little bit as well going forward. News to come. But I thought it was worth mentioning to the group.
Okay.
Cool.
Well,
Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Night, night.
thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank
Good night.
you. Bye-bye.